Well, we've reviewed three studies in the field of social psychology. They were all problematic. They all sought to address genuine concerns, and those concerns lay in the domain of the social, which is not something that we have a firm scientific grip on. We noted at the start that the manner in which we characterize mind determines what we think the social is, determines whether we are willing to say things like putting on a uniform changes your personality, where we attribute responsibility. There are many, many routes to follow here. There is not a single scientific story that emerges. And please recall that throughout this module, we have never defined mind. We've never said what a mind is. The simplistic cartoon description of cognitive science as figuring out how the mind works assumes that the mind exists. Cognitive science is actually the mad discipline of chasing after your own tail, trying to find something that accords with your intuitions about mind. It is a radically interdisciplinary undertaking, and so we don't have to analyze humans within a single framework. We're going to review in this video, which will be a bit longer than usual, we're going to review three radical alternatives, and there are many others, which should give you a sense that we haven't exhausted our options here, and that some questions are better articulated in one framework rather than another. So we're going to start with two relatively recent contributions to the field. These are the notion of extended mind and distributed cognition. Now, both of these are radically different from the manner in which mind is treated in psychology as the discrete entity belonging to a single individual. But they're both fairly conservative in that they often try to provide accounts that are much in line with, that address the same kinds of questions as, for example, computational theory of mind. So if we were to start from the common grounds that mental operations are somehow information processing based on representations, we don't have to accept that. It's a conservative view within the computational theory of mind. But we can adopt that starting point here to arrive at very different conclusions. Both the extended mind thesis and the idea of distributed cognition will encourage us to ask whether minds can be considered individual or limited within the body. Are they confined? Is mind something that goes on inside your head? Or even is mind singular? So those are interesting questions. So the way the term cognition is often unpacked refers to capacities that we have to perceive the world, to make use of a faculty called memory, to plan, to figure stuff out. And if that is cognition, then we'll note that we do a lot of perceiving, remembering, planning, solving using the technologies and affordances of the world around us. My perception right now is greatly facilitated by these glasses, without which I'm blind as a bat. If I ask you, what do you know? The question is going to depend on whether you have access to a computer or not, all right? You're going to say, I'll Google that. You kind of know what you might be able to know. Now, I can remove all access to computers and books and written stuff and ask you what you know, and you still have this sense that there's some questions that are in the space of things you possibly know, and there's some questions that you just haven't got a blind clue about. And that character doesn't seem to change when we reintroduce all these natural supports of computers, notes, writing, and so on. So in a paper called The Extended Mind, two philosophers, Andy Clark and Dave Chalmers, addressed this. And they said they complained that there was a tendency among thinkers of this stripe, thinkers who see mental operations as transformations of representations, symbol processing and all that. There was a bias on their part to privilege stuff that happens to go on inside the head when there was no obvious reason to do so. The core of this article is written on the slide. If, as we confront some task, a part of the world functions as a process which, were it done in the head, we would have no hesitation in recognizing as part of the cognitive process, then that part of the world is, so we claim, part of the cognitive process. So cognitive processes aren't all in the head. Now, you might like to revisit that definition after we look at an example of what they mean by this. And they illustrate this with a little story. It's a nice little story. It's about two characters. One is called Anna, and one is called Otto, and they both live in New York. Anna wants to go to the Museum of Modern Art, which is on 42nd Street. Anna remembers that it's on 42nd Street. She makes a plan to get there, and she goes and gets the bus and gets there. Good for Anna. She's going to the museum. Otto has Alzheimer's. He's coping very well with his Alzheimer's, but he has Alzheimer's. And he's learned, for example, that he can't trust what we think of as his memory, his unassisted memory. And so he keeps a notebook and he writes stuff down in the notebook. Now, Otto starts out with a plan as well. He wants to go to the Museum of Modern Art. And he looks up the notebook and finds it's on 42nd Street, and he goes and gets the bus there. So what they did was very, very similar. And in the case of Anna, she devised a plan, she made use of her memory, and then she went and executed the plan. Otto did exactly the same sequence of processes, but the middle step of memory involved his notebook, crucially involved his notebook. It doesn't work without his notebook. And yet there doesn't seem to be a principal difference between the two when we speak using these verbs of planning, remembering, and so on. And so the claim of the extended mind thesis here is that the notebook is part of Otto's cognitive system, and so cognition is not all in the head. Now, this should be a little bit unsettling. It is for very many people. If minds are not all in the brain or skull, then perhaps cognition is not entirely your province. Perhaps it's shared capacity. We'll get to that with the distributed mind. But you can see here that some of this uncertainty has arisen because we don't have fixed views of what we mean by mind or cognition. Here's another example of the extended mind thesis. You've probably played Scrabble, and you might find yourself with an array of letters like that. Now, if you're not playing on the computer, but you're playing with genuine physical tiles, the way Scrabble is meant to be played, what you do here is you start rearranging the letters. You're looking for possibilities, and you know that by rearranging the letters, you will see options that you wouldn't see if you just keep your hands off the letters. Now, how should we understand this process of rearranging the letters? I can deliberately not rearrange the letters, and then I'm definitely thinking very hard about possibilities. I'm still thinking about possibilities as I'm rearranging the letters. It's just got a lot easier. So it looks like this business of rearranging the letters in Scrabble is a constitutive part of what it is to think. So how far should we go with this? Now, there is no fixed answer to this, and the extended mind thesis has found enthusiastic uptake in some communities of thinkers. Others view it as very conservative because it still takes a view of cognition that shares all those terms of representational cognitive science, such as representation, transformation, symbols, information processing. Nevertheless, it has changed the game somewhat, and it encourages us to be a bit more fluid about how we think about minds and cognition. We've noted the difficulty that an individualist psychology has in addressing any social questions whatsoever. So socially extended cognition, that which we share, which we jointly achieve, that might admit of a different kind of description. And so what used to be a familiar vocabulary for talking about secret stuff inside our heads now becomes a bit more fluid, and we start to ask, well, could my mental states be partly constituted by the states of other thinkers. That may seem very, very strange if you think of your mental states as being something like what you do when you do mental arithmetic. And what about two wrestlers? Are their mental states separate from one another? There's a lot to think about here. And so anytime we raise questions about cognition, and particularly about mind, people seem to believe that they're inquiring into themselves. Now, the self notoriously defies any fixed description, although it's a useful term of art. So the extended mind thesis seems to open the door perhaps to an extended view of self as well. So that's extended mind. In the next little video, we'll move on and look at distributed cognition, and then we have some more.